She is somewhere in East Africa. The year is approximately 70,000 BC. She has been in labor for 6 hours. There is no hospital, no doctor, no midwife with a medical degree, no pain medication of any kind, no sterile instruments, no emergency option, just her and the people around her and a problem that needed solving right now. She survived. We know this because you exist. Every single human alive today is descended from a woman who went through exactly this. The question is what happened in that moment, who helped, what they knew, and how any of us made it through it all. Let's start with the biology, because the biology is where this story begins, and the biology is genuinely alarming. Every other primate on Earth gives birth relatively quickly. A chimpanzee, our closest living relative, delivers in about 2 hours, usually alone, usually in silence. The infant emerges facing downward, and the mother can reach down, guide the baby out, clear its airway, pull it to her chest. The whole process is difficult but manageable. Solo, unassisted, human birth is nothing like this. The human infant emerges facing backward away from the mother. She cannot see it. She cannot easily guide it. She cannot clear its airway without help. The baby has to rotate as it moves through the birth canal, a corkscrew movement that no other primate infant makes, because no other primate infant needs to. And the reason it has to do this is the reason everything about human childbirth became so complicated. The brain. Somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago, the human brain began expanding, slowly at first, then faster. The skull that housed it expanded too. And at some point, that skull became too large to pass easily through the birth canal that evolution had also been reshaping, narrowing it, optimizing it for bipedal walking. The same adaptation that let us stand upright and walk across continents made giving birth significantly more dangerous. We got smarter and it nearly killed us. It still does. Anthropologists called this the obstetric dilemma. The competing pressures of a large brain and an upright pelvis created a situation with no clean solution. The compromise the species landed on was this. Human babies are born earlier in their development than any other primate. A newborn chimpanzee can cling to its mother within hours. A newborn human cannot hold its own head up for months. We are born, in a very real sense, too soon. Still gestating. Still unfinished. Because if we waited until we were actually ready, the skull would be too large to survive the exit. This is the situation ancient humans were managing. A birth process longer, more painful, more dangerous, and more dependent on assistance than anything else in the primate world. And they were managing it without a single tool we would recognize as medical. So how did they do it? For a long time, the assumption was simple. They figured it out as they went. Birth was painful, dangerous, and random, and enough people survived to keep the species going. That was the theory. Brutal, efficient, impersonal, and it turns out to be wrong in a way that should make you rethink everything you think you know about prehistoric people. Because here's what the evidence actually shows. Ancient humans didn't just survive childbirth. They developed sophisticated, accumulated, transmitted systems for managing it. Not written down, not recorded. Not preserved in any archive, but real, detailed, effective enough to keep a species alive to 300,000 years of births without a single hospital. Let's talk about what we actually know. The oldest indirect evidence for assisted birth comes from the bones themselves. Paleoanthropologists studying the pelvic anatomy of ancient human females have found something that changes the entire story. The human birth canal is shaped in a way that makes unassisted birth not just difficult, but in many cases, anatomically impossible. The rotation the infant must perform, the tight dimensions of the passage, the backward-facing exit, these are not features that allow for solo delivery. They are features that essentially require a second pair of hands. Researcher Wenda Trevethan spent decades studying the evolution of human birth and reached a conclusion that is both obvious and profound. She argues that assisted birth is not a modern invention. It is not a product of civilization or medicine or organized society. It is a biological necessity that has been with us since the moment our skulls became too large for our pelvises. Since before we were fully human. Assistance at birth, she argues, is as old as our species, maybe older. Think about what this means. Before language as we know it, before fire was fully controlled, before any tool more sophisticated than a shaped stone, there were already people gathered around a laboring woman doing something to help. Not because someone told them to, not because there was a protocol, because the alternative was watching her die, and the group had learned over generations of watching that staying and helping produced better outcomes than leaving. This is not medicine. This is something older than medicine. This is pattern recognition operating at the level of survival. But here's where it gets more complicated. Because knowing that assistance happened tells us very little about what that assistance actually looked like. And for that, we have to look at the one window we have into prehistoric birth practices that nobody talks about. We have to look at what didn't change. Anthropologists studying traditional birth practices in cultures that maintained pre-industrial methods into the modern era have found something remarkable. Across cultures with no contact with each other, separated by oceans and continents and thousands of years, the same core practices appear again and again. Not similar practices, the same ones. Specific birthing positions, specific breathing techniques, specific ways of supporting the mother's body, specific handling of the infant immediately after delivery, specific management of the placenta, specific practices for the hours and days following birth. The convergence is too precise to be coincidence. These practices didn't emerge independently in each culture. They were carried, transmitted, preserved across migrations and generations and the collapse of entire civilizations. Because they worked. And in a world where the alternative was death, things that worked got remembered. The upright position is one of the clearest examples. In virtually every traditional culture ever documented, women do not give birth lying flat on their backs. They squat, they kneel, they sit supported, they stand. The horizontal position that became standard in Western medicine in the 17th and 18th centuries, adopted largely because it was more convenient for physicians, is actually one of the worst positions for human birth. It works against gravity. It narrows the birth canal. It increases the duration of labor and the risk of complications. The positions that ancient humans used, that traditional midwives and every culture preserved, are biomechanically superior. They open the pelvis. They use gravity. They shorten labor. We know this not because ancient humans told us, but because modern obstetric research keeps confirming what traditional birth attendants never forgot. They knew things we unlearned, and the positions were only the beginning. Because the most extraordinary body of knowledge that ancient birth attendants carried wasn't about how to position the body. It was about what to put into it. Ancient humans had no epidurals, no pharmaceutical intervention of any kind. What they had was plants, and the knowledge of those plants, accumulated over thousands of years of careful observation, was more sophisticated than anyone gives it credit for. Blue cohosh, native to North America, has been used by indigenous midwives across cultures for centuries to stimulate uterine contractions and manage the progression of labor. When modern pharmacologists analyzed it, they found it contains compounds called calosaponin and calophyllosauponin that act directly on uterine muscle tissue. It does what traditional practitioners said it did, exactly. The plant that a woman in a longhouse in 1200 CE pressed into the hands of a laboring mother was pharmacologically active in ways that wouldn't be understood for another 8 centuries. The same story runs across continents. Shepherd's purse, used in European and Asian traditional medicine to slow postpartum hemorrhage, contains oxytocin-like compounds that cause uterine contraction. Raspberry leaf, used in virtually every traditional midwifery system ever documented, has been shown to tone uterine muscle in ways relevant to labor. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain, was used in European traditional birth practice for centuries to manage dangerous postpartum bleeding. It is the direct ancestor of ergometrine, one of the most important drugs in modern obstetrics, still used in delivery rooms today. This knowledge was not accidental. It was the product of generations of women watching what happened, noting what helped, discarding what didn't, and passing the useful parts forward. The original clinical trial was a woman in labor and a birth attendant who remembered what her teacher told her, going back in an unbroken chain to a woman crouching over a fire in a cave who noticed once that the tea she'd been given made something better. That chain of observation and transmission is one of the longest-running scientific experiments in human history. It just never got written down. But plants weren't the only tool, and here's where the story takes a turn nobody talks about. Ancient humans understood something about pain that modern medicine is only beginning to take seriously again. The presence of a known, trusted, calm person during labor dramatically changes the experience and outcome of birth. Dramatically. Not marginally. Dramatically. In 1980, researchers Marshall Klaus and John Cannell published a study that would eventually change obstetric practice around the world. They had noticed that in many traditional cultures, a specific figure was always present at birth. Not a physician, not a surgeon. A woman who had given birth herself, who knew the process, who stayed close, who touched, who spoke calmly, who did not leave. They called this figure a doula, from the ancient Greek word for a woman who serves. Klaus and Cannell ran controlled trials. Women who had a continuous supportive companion present during labor had significantly shorter labors, significantly lower rates of complications, significantly lower rates of cesarean delivery, significantly better outcomes for the infants. The presence of another calm human being, doing nothing more than being present and supportive, changed the biology of birth. This is not a soft finding. This has been replicated dozens of times across different cultures and contexts. The doula effect is real and it is measurable, and it is also 300,000 years old. Because that figure, the experienced woman who stays, who knows, who supports, who does not leave, that is not an invention. That is the oldest birth attendant in human history. She predates every medical system ever devised. She predates writing. She predates civilization. She was there in East Africa 70,000 years ago when the woman in our opening was 6 hours into labor and needed someone who had done this before. Let's not romanticize this. Because the ancient world was not gentle and it did not always work. The mortality rates were real. Estimates based on skeletal analysis and comparative anthropology suggest that somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 women in the prehistoric world died in childbirth or from complications shortly after. Infant mortality in the first days of life was staggering. A significant percentage of pregnancies ended in outcomes that no knowledge and no skill could prevent. And the bones tell that story too. Paleoanthropologists examining ancient skeletal remains have found women buried with undelivered infants still inside them. Pelvic bones showing the fractures and stress injuries of prolonged obstructed labor. Remains of mothers and infants interred together in what appear to be deliberate, careful burials, suggesting that the communities who lost them understood exactly what had happened and felt the weight of it. These were not statistics to the people who lived them. They were names, faces. The woman who made a certain thing, who laughed a certain way, who was supposed to be there in the morning and wasn't. But here is where the story gets darker still. Because for much of human history, the line between birth attendant and ritual specialist was not a line at all. It was the same person. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in the world, dating to ancient Egypt around 1550 BCE, contains detailed instructions for managing childbirth. Specific positions. Specific plant preparations, specific handling of complications, but woven to every instruction is invocation, prayer. The calling of specific deities to the room, Hathor, goddess of fertility, Bes, the dwarf god who protected mothers in labor, whose image was painted on the walls of birthhouses specifically so laboring women could see it, Taweret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess, whose amulets have been found in Egyptian homes across 3,000 years of history, worn by pregnant women seeking protection. In ancient Mesopotamia, the incantation texts recovered from Assyrian and Babylonian sites describe birth rituals of extraordinary detail, specific words to be spoken at specific moments, specific knots to be tied and untied to symbolize the opening of the passage, specific protective figures placed at the threshold of the room to prevent malevolent spirits from entering during the vulnerable hours when the boundary between life and death was considered dangerously thin. Ancient Greece had Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, whose presence had to be requested and whose absence was believed to stall labor. There are accounts of labors prolonged for days because the goddess had not been properly invoked. There are accounts of rituals performed desperately in the middle of the night to call her attention. And there are accounts of labors that ended well, that were attributed entirely to her arrival. These were not superstitions layered on top of the real knowledge. For the people practicing them, they were the real knowledge. Because in a world where the margin between life and death in the birth room was thin and the tools available were limited, the framework that gave the experience meaning, that told the mother she was not alone, that told the birth attendant her work mattered beyond the physical, that framework was also doing something real. It was reducing panic. It was increasing the calm, focused presence that Klaus and Cannell would measure thousands of years later and call the doula effect. It was social technology wearing the clothes of religion. And it worked in ways that had nothing to do with whether the goddess actually showed up. In 2023, researchers studying ancient DNA from prehistoric European populations found evidence of something long theorized but never confirmed. Women in Neolithic communities were not giving birth alone or in nuclear family units. The genetic evidence pointed to multi-generational female networks. Grandmothers, aunts, sisters, cousins clustered together in ways that suggest cooperative child-rearing and cooperative birth support extending back thousands of years before recorded history. The grandmother hypothesis, first proposed by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes in the 1990s, argues that the evolutionary reason human women live decades past reproductive age, something almost unique in the animal kingdom, is precisely this. Grandmothers who could no longer give birth could support the births of others, could carry the knowledge, could be the person in the room who had seen this before, who knew what to do, who did not panic. Evolution kept grandmothers alive because grandmothers kept everyone else alive. Think about the weight of that. The reason human women have menopause, the reason your grandmother existed past the age of 50, may be directly connected to a birth that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago in a cave or on an open plain, where an older woman stayed in the room because she knew something the younger ones didn't yet. We are here because someone stayed. We are here because someone knew. We are here because a chain of women, stretching back further than any record reaches, passed something forward in the only way available to them, not in writing, not in textbooks, in presence, in hands, in the calm voice of someone who had been through it before and come out the other side and was there to say without words that you would too. Modern obstetrics is extraordinary. The reduction in maternal and infant mortality over the last century is one of the genuine triumphs of human knowledge. A woman giving birth today in a hospital with access to modern care is safer than any woman in human history has ever been. That is real, and it matters, and it should not be minimized. But something was also lost in the transition. The continuous presence, the familiar face, the accumulated experiential knowledge of women who had done this and watched this and learned this through direct transmission across generations. The medicalization of birth solved enormous problems and created new ones, a recognized phenomenon in modern obstetrics, as hospitals worldwide have begun reintroducing continuous labor support, midwifery models, and birth companions, not as alternatives to medicine but as complements to it. Because it turns out, the thing ancient humans knew, the thing preserved across 300,000 years of births in every culture and every continent, the thing that kept showing up independently wherever humans were having babies, was not superstition. It was correct. Tonight, somewhere in the world, a woman is in labor. And if she is lucky, there is someone in the room who knows what they are doing, who stays, who does not leave, who has seen this before. That person is doing the oldest job in human history. Older than farming, older than writing, older than any civilization anyone has ever studied. They are doing what the woman in East Africa 70,000 years ago needed someone to do. And the reason that job still exists, the reason it never disappeared, even when everything else about human life changed beyond recognition, is the same reason you exist. It worked.